Daf Yomi, Tractate Bava, page 12a, starting at the top of the page, with the words Lebasar Denafak, Amar Lahu Ula. The Gemara relates, after Rav Nachman exited the study hall, Ula said to the remaining sages in the study hall, "In truth, this is what Rabbi Elazar said. A slave can be collected as payment even when collecting from the debtor's orphans. Generally, when collecting a debt from the debtor's orphans, the creditor can collect only from the land that they inherited from their father, which is liened to the debt. Rabbi Elazar rules that a creditor can also collect from the slaves they inherited, as he holds that, in this regard, the legal status of slaves is like that of land. Ula did not reveal this fact to Rav Nachman, as he knew that Rav Nachman disagreed and held that the legal status of slaves is like that of movable property. When he heard of Ula's revelation, Rav Nachman said, "Ula evaded me, as had he told me Rabbi Elazar's full opinion, I would have brought proofs against his opinion." The Gemara relates, there was an incident in Naharda, and the judges of Naharda collected, on behalf of a creditor, slaves that orphans had inherited from the debtor. This was an incident in Pumbedita, and Rav Chana bar Bizna collected slaves from orphans as repayment for a debt. Rav Nachman said to those judges, "Go and return those slaves to the orphans. And if you do not do so, we will collect the value of the slaves from the proceeds of your own mansions in order to compensate the orphans for their loss, as you have made an elementary mistake in your ruling, and therefore you are responsible to rectify it." Rava said to Rav Nachman, "There is Ula, there is Rabbi Elazar, there are the judges of Narda, and there is Rabbi Chana bar Bizna, all of whom ruled based on the assumption that the legal status of slaves is like that of land, in accordance with whose opinion does the master, in other words, you, Rav Nachman, hold." Rav Nachman said to him, "I know a brisa that supports my opinion. As Avimi teaches, a document that prevents the sabbatical year from abrogating an outstanding debt, a prosbol, takes effect upon a debt assumed by one who owns land, but a prosbol does not take effect upon a debt assumed by one who owns slaves of the debtor. And movable property is acquired together with the land one acquires through the act of acquisition performed on the land, but movable property cannot be acquired together with the slaves that one acquires. Both halachot assume that in these cases the legal status of slaves is not like that of land." The Gemara suggests, let us say that this issue is the subject of a dispute between Tanaim in the following Braitot. One Braita teaches, if one sold slaves and land to a buyer, and the buyer took possession of the slaves alone, he does not thereby acquire the land. If he took possession of the land alone, he does not thereby acquire the slaves. If one sold land and movable property to a buyer, and the buyer took possession of the land alone, he thereby also acquires the movable property. If he took possession of the movable property alone, he does not thereby acquire the land. If one sold slaves and movable property to a buyer, and the buyer took possession of the slaves alone, he does not thereby acquire the movable property. If he took possession of the movable property alone, he does not thereby acquire the slaves. But isn't it taught in another Braita? If the buyer took possession of the slaves alone, he thereby also acquires the movable property. This directly contradicts the ruling in the parallel clause of the previous Braita. What, is it not the case that it is about this that they disagree? That one sage, the Tana of the second Braita, holds that the legal status of slaves is like that of land, and the other sage, the Tana of the first Braita, holds that the legal status of slaves is like that of movable property? The Gemara rejects this. Rav Ika, the son of Rav Ami, said, "According to everyone, the legal status of slaves is generally like that of land, and therefore that which is taught in the second Braita that by taking possession of the slaves, he also acquires the movable property is properly understood. And that which is taught in the first Braita, that in such a case he does not acquire the movable property, the reason for this ruling is that the Tana of that Braita holds that in order for the movable property to be acquired together with land, we require that he acquire land similar to fortified cities in Judah, 2 Chronicles 21:3, which do not move around. Slaves, even if their legal status is generally like that of land, do not fulfill this requirement. The reason behind the need for land to be like the fortified cities in Judah, fortified Arim Mitsudot Yehuda. Yeah. The land must be similar to fortified cities in Judah. The reason why it must be like this is the halacha that one can acquire movable property together with land is derived from this verse. As we learned in the Mishnah, Kedushin 26a, property that does not serve as a guarantee, in other words, movable property is acquired together with property that does serve as a guarantee, in other words, land. This might be a Kinyan Agav. In other words, land by be it through the buyer giving money to the seller, by the seller giving the buyer the bill of sale, or by the buyer performing an act of taking possession. The Gemara asks, from where is this matter derived? Chizkiah said, as the verse states, and their father gave them great gifts of silver and of gold and of precious things with fortified cities in Judah. 2 Chronicles 21:3. The verse indicates that the acquisition of the movable property was done together with that of the cities of Judah. There are those who say that Rav Yika stated a different answer. Rav Yika, son of Ami, said, according to everyone, the legal status of slaves is generally like that of movable property, and therefore that which is taught in the first Braita, that by taking possession of the slaves he does not also acquire the movable property, is properly understood. And that which is taught in the second Braita, that in such a case he acquires the movable property, applies to a case in which, at the moment the slave was acquired, the movable property was still upon him. For example, the slave was holding it, and it could therefore be acquired together with the slave. This is because one's slave is considered like one's courtyard, and any item that is placed within it is acquired for its owner. Gemara asks, but even if the movable property was still upon him, what of it? Even if one claims a slave is like a courtyard, he is a mobile courtyard. A mobile courtyard does not acquire items placed upon it. And if you would say that the case is one where the slave is standing at the time of the transaction, that is still insufficient. As did Rava say, anything that does not acquire when moving also does not acquire when it is standing or sitting. The fact that the slave can move gives him the status of a mobile courtyard regardless if he is currently moving or not. The Gemara concludes, and the halacha is that where a slave is bound up, kafus, he's bound up and unable to walk, his status is like that of an immobile courtyard, and his master will acquire anything that is placed upon him at that time. Okay.